My name is Rachel, also known as Sprout Magoot, and thanks so much for joining me. Today I'd like to teach you a little bit about Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. It is an excellent book for the present moment. What I think is really funny about this book is that I really don't want to be teaching you about this book, but he also did not want to be writing this book. In the introduction, he says, "Why am I writing this book?" In all serenity, my answer is that there are too many idiots on this earth. And now that I've said it, I have to prove it. And if that ain't a mood, I don't know what is. So the other principle that I'm taking with this video is that done is better than perfect. So that's why I'm recording this on Zoom. That's why the formatting is not ideal. But I think it's really important to get this out here like as soon as possible. I'm envisioning this being the first in a series of videos going through the chapters of this book and then covering eventually his second book, The Wretched of the Earth. So today's video will be covering Black Skin, White Masks, just the introduction, and a little bit of the foreword, which is by Kwame Anthony Appiah. This version that I'm reading from was translated by Richard Philcox. It was published in the year 2008, but the original book was published in 1952. So what is my credentials in being able to talk about this book? So firstly, I have a Master's of Human Rights degree with a concentration in research methods. I have a bachelor's in sociocultural anthropology with double minors in English, women's, and gender studies. And during that degree, I focused on non-Western and non-white women's literature. In my undergrad years, I was a volunteer educator, and I taught about intersectional feminist theory in a similar way to this, a similar medium, I guess you could say. As well as during my undergrad years, I spent a lot of time with a mentor who was an expert on colonialism and literature about African colonialism. So I got a lot of like one-on-one training and teaching about this topic. And finally, I'm a total dork who spent way too much time in the library stacks and read almost all of my required course readings because I thought we had to, and now I'm glad I did. So enjoy. Why teach about this book in this present moment? I think there's a lot of connections to the present moment that makes it really valuable to learn about. So for example, we're extremely polarized in America right now and really divided under colonial rulers. Think about the categories: left, right, black, white, rural, urban. These are strategies of the colonizer in order to divide the populace to be able to conquer them more efficiently. So Frantz Fanon is primarily talking about the black and white divide in African colonialism, but we can still learn about the processes through his writing. Second, many Republicans voted for Trump and support colonizing ventures. That's a new wild card thing for 2024, apparently. They support racism and want like a return to the 1950s, this phenomenon of Make America Great Again. They're appealing to this like idealized and romanticized version of the past. But this book was actually written in the 1950s and is about what was happening in the world in the 1950s. So this book is actually contemporary and relevant to exactly what they want to turn America into. The rise of colonialism internationally in the last couple of years means that we definitely didn't learn a lesson, so now we need to decolonize harder. And I argue learning this book's lessons will free you from the narratives and behaviors which cause harm to yourself and others, whether it be through racism or through colonization, economic exploitation of other countries, those sorts of things. And finally, learning about the past and the concept of the other allows us to understand our present moment in American history, and allows us to dive deeper into the nuance of why things are the way they are, how they actually work, culturally and like in a narrative, like discourse analysis way, so that we can make informed decisions about how we want to shape the future. Because of course, if we don't have all the facts, and we don't understand the mechanisms of how our culture and society works, we're not going to make as effective decisions in shaping the future. And then another reason why to teach about this right now is that I believe that theory is powerful. Understanding literary and sociocultural theory helps us to understand, once again, those logics, those mechanisms underlying our society and our culture, so that we can create change in an effective way. If you don't understand what you're trying to change, how can you change it well and effectively, for example? So just a few notes on this book. It is a little bit dense to read it yourself. And so I've done a lot of like almost like translating work in making this presentation. So for example, he uses a lot of we, our, us pronouns to refer to himself. And like girl, same, I do that a lot. We need to go to the store. We need to do this. We need to do that. In my head, I'm referring to the council of elders that, you know, runs my brain, the three-ring circus of me, myself, and I. But in this case, it's like a objective, like third party kind of sense in his writing. Secondly, he uses the word man to mean humankind. And this is both a product of his time. So like a lot of books by academics in the 1950s do this, where they'll say like man is, you know, developing a way to go to the moon, for example. And when they mean like humankind is developing new technologies or whatever. In addition, it was also originally written in French. So there's a lot of like gendered nouns and sentences that like may not actually need to be gendered, if that makes sense. So like perhaps the translator said he, him, his, mankind, men, when it was like actually a masculine noun that was used in the original manuscript. And then also Fanon does regard men and women as equal, or at least that is how I interpreted his writing in this introduction. For example, he says in one part, and in this regard, we are thinking equally of men like Gobineau or women like Mayet Capacia. So like he's talking about men in these sentences, but he's meaning like all of humankind, and men and women are equal in this narrative. So finally, the whole book uses a framing device similar to like giving a testimony at a hearing, or a doctor who is describing a case study, because he was a psychologist and a doctor. So he's like, for example, he says at one point, before opening the proceedings, we would like to say a few things. So you can see how it's a little bit dense to read this book. And I did a lot of like translating work to kind of put it back into first person and eliminate a lot of the framing devices to get to what he's actually trying to argue. So, what is he trying to argue? He begins his argument by asking, what does man want? And what does the Black man want? He doesn't answer this in the introduction. He's going to do that more in the chapters that follow. But he does follow those questions by explaining that Black people aren't people yet in terms of African colonization and the decolonization movement in the 1950s as he's writing this. He says they're trapped in a universe of colonial ideology, that they need to liberate their own minds and their bodies first in order to realize and like become their full human selves. Therefore, the goal of this essay and the book broadly is to attempt to understand the Black-white relationship and with the ultimate goal, of course, of putting an end to a vicious cycle of racism and racial hierarchies in the world. So that is the main argument of the book. Going from that point, he says that we can make a new concept of being human, with the potential for self-consciousness, transcendence, love, and understanding. And I really loved this quote. I did add some little brackets of my own translation, which I'll use as I read this. So humankind is not only the potential for self-consciousness or negation. If it be true that consciousness is transcendental, we must also realize that this transcendence is obsessed with the issue of love and understanding. Humankind is a yes, resonating from cosmic harmonies, uprooted, dispersed, dazed, and doomed to watch as the truths humans have elaborated vanish one by one. We must stop projecting this antinomy into the world. End quote. And so at first I was like, wow, what a beautiful quote. Secondly, I thought, what in the world is antinomy in this context? And that's defined by dictionary.com as an opposition between one law, principle, rule, and another, or in philosophical terms, a contradiction between two statements, both apparently obtained by correct reasoning, which I think is the more applicable definition in this instance. So he's saying that Black and white people have obtained this understanding of what it means to be Black, what it means to be human by correct reasoning, but they're only holding like one piece of the puzzle, that we need to stop projecting those contradictory statements to the world and embrace this love, understanding, connection, and unity. So the method that he uses in order to explain these really complex issues is psychological analysis. Once again, I mentioned that Frantz Fanon was a doctor and a psychologist, and he uses his skills and tools as a doctor to essentially pathologize racism and treat it like a mental illness, which is, it's a take, we can argue about whether or not that is the right take, but in this case, it is very effective as a tool because he's able to sort of find these discourses underpinning society, almost like how a modern day counselor uses cognitive behavioral theory, CBT, in order to challenge, identify, and question the thoughts and narratives in a person's head in order to change their behaviors. He does note that ending alienation, well, first of all, let's back up a minute. What is alienation? Because I think that can be a really hard word to define in these contexts. So I threw in a little post from dictionary.com again about what alienation means. So it can be the act of alienating or of causing someone to become indifferent or hostile to the other. As in the example, the advocacy group fights against prejudice and social alienation of immigrants. It can also be like a state of mind of being alienated, withdrawn, or isolated from the objective world, as through indifference or disaffection. So the group's alienation from mainstream society, their separation, their not feeling connected to society. Or third, the act of turning away, transferring, or diverting, such as the alienation of land and resources from African peoples. After explaining that he uses the method of psychological analysis, he notes that ending alienation overall requires brutal awareness of the social and economic realities of the world. And so, in other words, he says the answer is to get quote unquote woke, become aware of what is going on around you, try to understand your social and economic reality. And that's going to help with not being withdrawn, not being isolated, not being hostile, not turning away, transferring, or diverting away from reality, but instead connecting. Becoming aware is drawing you inward towards the other, not away from it. So you can see why it would be useful for a colonizing empire to demonize something like being aware or being woke, quote unquote. If you have your followers willingly turning off their minds, they are then also by nature willingly turning away from each other. A lack of understanding, a lack of unity. It's important to note that he uses psychoanalysis in his book. And psychoanalysis is nowadays mostly a defunct method. We don't really use that anymore. Nowadays, psychologists use other theories, like I mentioned before, cognitive behavioral theories, CBT, somatic theory, dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT, etc. So while Fanon's methods might be considered out of date, his findings are impactful and timeless, which I definitely think that you will find the deeper we delve into these. It was also kind of mentioned in the foreword by Kwame Anthony Appiah. He says, we may no longer find the psychoanalytic framework as useful in understanding racism's causes and effects as he did, but the vigor of his evocations on the psychological damage to both the colonized and the colonizer remains. His work remains as a powerful reminder of the psychological burdens that colonial racism imposed on its victims. So it's still a worthwhile venture to learn about what happened to people in the past and try to understand how things work through the tools of the past, because then we can recontextualize it into the modern day using our new tools and experiences. So getting back into the introduction here, Frantz Fanon adds some notes and clarifications to his argument. He says, Black people are, quote, no more amiable than the Czech. In other words, no one is better than the other. We need to liberate humans from colonialism because it's hurting all of us. He also notes that he has no pity for colonizers, such as missionaries or governors, who mean well, because getting into the history a little bit here, like a lot of missionaries at the time, for example, believed that they were saving the souls of Black people by going in and converting them to Christianity and essentially paving the way for colonial governors to come and take over the land and exploit the natural resources and then convert all of the people into slaves. So they paved the way by making them welcoming to the white colonizers by saying, oh, we're nice people. I just want to save your soul. You know, let me teach you about Jesus. Let me teach you how to learn, how to read the Bible. Jesus loves you. Isn't that great? All that stuff. Fast forward further into the colonial enterprise, and the missionary is arguing that the Bible, you know, says that slavery is natural and good and right. It's like a progressive change from being well-meaning, wanting to help the colonized, turning into being one of the very people keeping them in slavery and bondage, not only in body, but also in mind. So Frantz Fanon says, they're just as sick as people who are like just flat out racist. They just don't realize the harm that they're doing. Secondly, he says any attempts to, quote, whiten one's race is as wretched as those who hate white men. So like the vice versa is like Black people who want to be more like white people, those who want to assimilate to the white culture, are just as wretched as those who are like stuck in their hatred of white men. And that's not to say that like it's not like victim blaming, for example, that like it would be very understandable to hate white people if you were literally enslaved by them and deeply, deeply wounded, exploited, hurt by them. But he's talking about like if we want to come together in the future, those who advocate hate for white people are not helping with that venture. And it's actually harming you in that you are not enabling that future of coming together to happen. Next, he warns to be wary of zealousness. So examples, synonyms of zealots are bigots, cranks, extremists. So be wary of those people because it's, quote, an omen of fire, famine, poverty, and contempt, aka hate, for all of man or humankind. Those with extreme beliefs and attitudes will often bring about really extreme methods. They're also filled with a lot of anger usually, and while the anger isn't bad when used for love and liberation as like an empowering fire, it can also be used as hatred. It can be used to burn others, to destroy rather than create. And I think that's kind of what he's getting at here, to sort of check yourself and make sure that you're not coming at this in the form of extremism or having a prejudicial attitude against the other, whether that other is Black people, white people, left, right, any divide that you can think of. Because our goal, once again, is coming together as humanity. He says that zealousness is the weapon of the powerless. So when you have no power, it is natural that, sure, you would go to an extremist belief, and that can like increase heat and tension. So rather than wielding the fire to hone a weapon, he says, use the fire to warm up the self and keep your own fire burning. Go inside yourself to find your own meaning and make your own meaning. So those are some important notes and clarifications on his argument. I thought this was really funny. He says, in an age of skepticism, when according to a group of salauds, sense can no longer be distinguished from nonsense, it becomes arduous to descend to a level where the categories of sense and nonsense are not yet in use. And there's a translator's note underneath this sentence that says, Salaud is the Sartrean definition of 1, someone who refuses to take responsibility for their actions, 2, demonstrates their bad faith, 3, uses a form of self-deception, 4, has a denial of human freedom, and 5, an abdication of responsibility toward oneself and others. Well, first of all, I was like, isn't this sentence so similar to our post-truth era of Trumpism, of this fake news of reality, when you can't tell what's real anymore? And don't those salutes sound a lot like American Congress? Isn't that just like exactly the definition of Congress right now? So I just thought that was really funny. So he's literally writing and talking about a time that's very similar to us, in response to a lot of people like Congress, like people we're trying to change and make change with. So in this introduction, he gives us a little situation overview, in addition to the previous quote. He explains that white people are stuck in whiteness and their view of reality as white people, and vice versa. Black people are stuck in blackness and their view of reality as black people. He says, fact, some whites consider themselves superior to blacks, end quote. Another quote, another fact, some blacks want to prove at all costs to the whites that they possess equal intelligence. That made me think, of course, I wonder what happens when we no longer value intelligence, as in American society right now. We'll probably get to that in later chapters. He explains that he is going to use psychological terminology to reveal the discourses and emotional disorder or dysregulation experienced by colonized and colonizing people. He aims for the destruction of all the above points and this situation as it stood. He says that we need to try to assume that the human condition is universal between Black and white people, also between men and women. And I wonder how he would react to non-binary gender nowadays, which is another aside that we might get into in later chapters. So basically, here are our founding situations, context, conditions that he's making his argument from. He says that the source of the situation is that we learned it in childhood. I loved this quote. It says, man's misfortune, Nietzsche said, was that he was once a child. How unfortunate. Yes, we did learn all of these discourses in childhood, but we control our fates and our wellness in the same way that the fate of the mentally unhealthy is in their own hands. And in that instance, he was speaking from experience as a psychologist. He explains that we're not doomed, that we have the power to change our own realities and our own futures. And it would be foolish not to try. I mean, whether you receive, for example, a mental health diagnosis, or if you are taught this information about the discourses on colonialism, do not feel disempowered. In fact, the opposite. Let's feel empowered and realize we are a person with agency who can act to change the world. And your own reality, your own conception and understanding of what is happening in the present moment and what happened in the past. So he explains then that the source of this inferiority complex of the colonized comes from a double process. The first step is economic in nature, and then the second is in internalizing, or he uses the term epidermalization, so like literally laying it on your skin of inferiority, in the case of like black skin, sort of hinting on the title here, Black Skin, White Masks. Next, Fanon moves on to really explain important differences between the collective and the individual. He says that Black alienation is a social, not an individual question or problem. We make our society, each individual, we contribute to our culture and our society, and we control our own outcomes, not only in our own personal life, but also as a collective when all of those individuals work together. So I also really like this quote. The prognosis is in the hands of those who are prepared to shake the worm-eaten foundations of the edifice. So basically, throw off the lies in order to heal. And he explains that liberation must be both on the individual and the societal level. Let's say you were able to achieve, say, individual liberation. You run off to a cabin in the woods somewhere and you're able to live freely. That is a flawed result. It's not true liberation. And then vice versa. It's a mistake to think that they're linked in mutual dependence. So, for example, liberating yourself doesn't also liberate society, and vice versa. Liberating society doesn't necessarily liberate the self. You have to work both on an individual and collective basis to challenge these really deep norms and discourses in society. He also gives a really interesting warning. He says, don't flee to the spiritual by insisting that it's a matter of salvation of the soul, saying, this Calvinist sense of like, we need to suffer here on earth, our salvation is in the future, in heaven. He's like, no, we can fix this here and now in the material world for the living. Don't flee to the spiritual and like give up on the earth and our material reality. We can fix this. So next he moves on to a couple of assertions. So firstly, he says that he'll break down his methods in later chapters, not in the introduction, like how he actually did his psychological analysis. So he skipped out on that, which is interesting. Second, he says that his focus is specifically on Black people. But through learning and focusing on Black people in the narrative, we naturally have to learn about white people because of the relationship of dichotomy, white, Black, left, right, etc. Third point, he makes a really interesting statement that I'm going to need to research because I don't fully understand it. He says, quote, "The savage will not be included here. Certain elements have not yet had enough impact on him." I'm not sure why he uses the word savage to perhaps mean like indigenous, and I'm not sure why he differentiates the impact of colonial discourse on the indigenous yet, and with that caveat of yet. So perhaps he'll get into that in later chapters, or perhaps I need to do some outside reading to explain that. Fourth, he explains that Black and white races are juxtaposed in a binary, as I explained before, and that resulted in a psycho-existential complex. So in psychological terms, complex is like the full understanding of reality, encompassing all of your beliefs, your thought narratives, your cultural underpinnings. So it's a psychological and existential complex. We aim to analyze it in order to destroy it. How can you change or destroy what you don't understand? So that's what he's asserting. He says that you may not recognize yourself in the book while talking about white and Black people. Quote, "But the fact I feel alien to the world of the schizophrenic in no way diminishes their reality." So even though you're not identifying with the people in the book, let's say, which, let's be honest, you're going to identify with some of them because of how pervasive and like enduring so many of these colonial narratives are. But if you're still like distanced in that way, it's still worthwhile to learn about someone else's experience and understand their view and experience of reality, especially in the context of colonialism, because there's been so much suffering and exploitation that we can very directly change and improve the conditions for those who are suffering. Continuing on with his assertions, he says that he draws from personal experience and interactions with people around Europe and Africa, but he does find that the conclusions that he draws rings true across class and across locations. I find it interesting that he's drawing from his personal experience in this way because it can be essentially taken as hearsay. It's like we are being asked to believe that this is what that person said a priori. There's like no field notes, there's no like evidence for what he has given other than his memory and his experience of reality. But in a way, that almost also serves his purposes in writing this book by asserting I am a full human person whose experiences and understanding of life and reality are valid because I am experiencing them. I don't need the validation and backing of white academia, of credentials and qualifications, which he has anyways. But, you know, for example, using field notes, using the methods of the white anthropologist, which has been used to colonize and exploit the very people, himself included, that he is talking about in this book. So it is almost like an idea of like reclaiming your power by using your own experience, your own words, your own thoughts, and the experience, thoughts, and actions of others through your memories in order to write this book, make these arguments, etc. He also finally asserts that the book is framed as a clinical study. So if you recognize yourself in it, use it to get better. So once again, using that analysis of pathologizing racism and internalized racism as a mental illness. And once again, perhaps in the later chapters, we can discuss how valid or like how helpful that is, or whether that's right or wrong. But that's his method that he's using to underpin his argument. So why is he doing this? Why should we do this? He says, while every human problem and crisis wants to be solved right now, we can solve this issue, this crisis, in our time, in our generation, for ourselves. He says, and I love this, it is in no way is it up to me to prepare for the world coming after me. I am resolutely a man of my time. So he's saying, like, don't do this, you know, for your children, for the future. Do this for yourself. You deserve that. What an icon, first of all. Second of all, it's really ingenious because it does push you into the present moment. In a way, you could say that doing this for the future is you mentally pushing this away, distancing yourself. He's saying, no, not then, now, right now, we're going to fix it. He says, my reason for living is the future must be supported by the present. I must believe that I can change the present if I am to believe that the future comes from the present moment. So therefore, change must be possible in the present in order to facilitate a difference in the future. Very philosophical argument here. Basically, you know, change for yourself and do it now. And then we will also have a better future for you and everyone else. Next, he moves on to an outline of the book and a little chapter plan. Chapters 1 through 3 examine the Black man and Black people and, quote, determine his attitudes in a white world. Chapters 4 through 5 explain being the Black man with psychopathology and philosophy. Chapter 4 is a critical analysis of a book he, quote, considers dangerous. Ooh, spicy. We'll find out more. It's O. Menoni's Psychologie de la Colonization, Prospero and Caliban, The Psychology of Colonization. Also, it was published in 1950. And chapter 5, he titles The Lived Experience of the Black Man. He says, when confronted with his race, the Black man is striving to discover the meaning of Black identity and he will demonstrate in that chapter that the Black soul is a construction of white folk. And he makes an interesting note that, he quote, "There's nothing in common between the Black man in this chapter and the Black man who wants to sleep with the white woman. The latter wants to be white, or has a thirst for revenge in any case." He says that on the contrary, he's trying to discover Black identity. So I was a little confused by that sentence and like where that was coming from all of a sudden in this book outline. So I think it might be more clear once I've read chapter 5 and maybe done some outside reading. I might look up some more current perspectives on chapter 5. So from that chapter outline, he talks a little bit more about Black alienation because of the movements and history of the moment he was writing in. So we'll talk here a little bit about the movement of negritude. So educated Black men were feeling called by the slave of the myth of the spontaneous and cosmic Negro. And feels that he no longer understands other Black people and they don't understand him. So the more educated people were getting, the less they were relating to each other and vice versa. The educated Black man is pleased at first, develops the distance further into a lack of understanding and conflict between him and other Black people. And then he discovers the meaning of his humanity. So sort of getting into a basic history of the negritude movement. The Tate Museum says, quote, "It was an anti-colonial cultural and political movement founded by a group of African and Caribbean students in Paris in the 1930s who sought to reclaim the value of Blackness in African culture," end quote. It was very anti-assimilationist, which interestingly, they say, so at Encyclopedia Britannica, quote, although assimilation was theoretically based on a belief in universal equality, it still assumed the superiority of European culture and civilization over that of Africa, or assumed that Africa had no history or culture, end quote, which I think is really relevant today as well when we think about, the racism against undocumented migrants and this idea that they need to assimilate into American culture, that they need to learn English, behave more like the white people around them, which is essentially saying that your European style, Western American white culture and civilization is better or needs to be chosen in favor of their home and domestic culture, just because they are living on this space of land. The negritude movement was led by Martinician poet Aimé Césaire, which you may know him from his book Discourses on Colonialism, French Guyanese poet Léon Damas, and the future Senegalese president and poet Léopold Sédar Senghor. The aim of the movement was to promote the appreciation of the history and culture of Black people and draw attention to the experiences of the colonized and slaves. It did have a lot of problematic ideas, though, like the, quote, mystic warmth of African life, gaining strength from its closeness to nature and its constant contact with ancestors, end quote, in contrast to, quote, the soullessness and materialism of Western culture, end quote. And that's, like, those quotes are from Encyclopedia Britannica. So, that's a myth. That's not necessarily true. For example, that all of African life is mystical and warm and it's close to nature and everyone's always in contact with ancestors, and that Western culture is always soulless and materialist and has no connection to the ancestors whatsoever. And Frantz Fanon has a lot to say about this in his book, Black Skin, White Masks. So we'll definitely dig deeper in future chapters to his critiques. The negritude movement was also inspired, like they argued you can be inspired by past African art and traditions, but you need to respond to the present moment with innovation. And that's according to the Tate Museum. Then World War II hit, and the artists and founders moved internationally and ended up spreading the ideas globally. So they also sparked more localized movements in the places that they moved, like Haiti in the Caribbean, Nigeria in Africa, and so on. So Frantz Fanon has a lot to say critiquing the negritude movement. One of his ideas that I thought was interesting is he says it's less common that the educated Black man wants to feel one with other Black people who are less educated than him. Like essentially saying they're out of touch with the common Black man who is not highly educated. He says that the educated Black man then plunges into a, quote, black hole which rejects the present and the future in name of a mystical past, end quote. So they're in a way denying reality and diving into fantasy, into the imaginary, when they dream up this mystical past, this envisioning of Africa that is not necessarily reflective of the reality of Africa in that present moment. He moves on to explain that cultural relativity is important. So cultural relativity is the idea that each culture is distinct, unique, and equally like valid. So like no one culture is better than another. He says that his observations and conclusions are valid for the French Antillean, at least, quote, at least regarding the Black man on his home territory. So we can still learn about discourses and the colonial processes from his work, but we are not drawing like broad sweeping statements about men in general from his work. Like he's very much talking in the French Antillean context, but when he is making conclusions and generalizations about colonialism and how racism works, those features, transcend cultural borders. Next, he calls for further study to explain the difference between Antillians and Africans. And I think that's actually what his second book, The Wretched of the Earth, was. Ends the whole introduction by saying, perhaps he will do that study someday, which he did. Or perhaps, quote, it will no longer be necessary, in which case we can but have reason for applause. Aw, isn't that nice? That is a call for hope to us in the current moment as well. Perhaps someday it will no longer be necessary for people like me to do really long, complicated explanations of books by authors who didn't even want to write the book, because we're no longer going to be racist, colonialist, and divide each other. Instead, coming together. Yeah, Squeakers has a lot of thoughts on this. Do you want to come up here? No? Okay. So in summary, that was a lot of information. I really liked the quote by Aimé Césaire that Fanon opened the introduction with. It says, quote, I'm talking about millions of men whom they have knowingly instilled with fear and a complex of inferiority, whom they have infused with despair and trained to tremble, to kneel and behave like flunkies. Woo. So colonialism is incredibly relevant, present, and important to the modern day, especially as Trump is increasingly pursuing bald-faced colonialism, reaching out for places like Gaza. It's really important that we understand the mechanisms of colonialism so that we can prevent it from happening again in the future. He says that colonialism creates a juxtaposition between Black and white people, which creates a racial divide in both a philosophical concept and then a material reality. This cultural belief and these narratives were inherited from our parents and our society. It created inferiority complexes in Black people and superiority complexes in white people when compared to Black people. But also, it should be noted, white people have inferiority complexes to rich white colonizers. So this is a hierarchy of division that has been created under the system of colonialism. So Black people want to be white, white people want to be rich. All right, and so we can deconstruct those complexes, and we should do so for our own liberation. By understanding psychologically and philosophically how we are dominated by discourses of colonialism, we can learn how and where to deconstruct it in our lives and in our political system. Our fates are in our own hands. I'm going to get mentally healthier and more free, and I'm asking you to join me. So we're going to learn from Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks. This was the first video in what I hope is a series going through the rest of the chapters and then moving on to The Wretched of the Earth. So thanks so much for joining me if you made it all the way through. And I hope that you are well, that you are hopeful, empowered, and, learning how to be better and do better every single day. Love ya.